Yeah. Good morning. Since we're recording, I'm gonna do this one last time. You guys don't have to pay attention if you don't want to, but one more set of instructions on how to do independent work. One of the many ways. So let's say, for example, you want to write a paper about a pelican. Okay, first thing you need to do is have a document, right? So you go over here to the top right, go to Google Docs, start a blank document, name it whatever you want. I would recommend maybe your last name, and then like the topic that you are writing about. So Dianello's pelican, right? Once you've done that, you're going to, of course, I'm sorry to share it with me because it's my document, but you would go up here and type in my name and share it with me. Basically the same thing you did with pre-tabs. That's where you do it. So then let's say you're ready to write your paper. Again, can't use AI, can't reword your sources, and you obviously can't copy your sources. So the way I recommend doing that is two major ways you can do that. One, read your source as many times as possible and then just write it from memory, right? Write what you remember and then take what you wrote and then look back and make sure it's accurate to your source. Make sure that all the information you have in your paper is matched up by your source. And another thing you could do is this, right? So let's say, again, you're writing a paper about pelicans. Pelicans, Britannica. Yeah, there we go. That's a encyclopedia. So anyway, here you go. We got this article here about pelicans. You could just take notes, right? Instead of writing sentences, you just take notes. Like pelican, and then like dash, 7 or 8 species, right? And then pelican, / and then you can maybe just put, or a scientific name, : Pelicanus, or you could say genus, Pelicanus, right? Just shorthand all of this. And then just little notes, again, like a little bullet point. Just put large elastic throat pouches, habitat, : lakes, rivers, seacoasts, size, : 70 inches, wingspan, : 10 feet, weight, : 13 kilograms. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Maybe I guess I could show you since we still have 5 minutes. But what I'm saying is what you don't want to do, and a lot of people I've seen have been doing this. Let me show you a version of what I think people are doing. You don't want to take your information and then copy it and paste it and then just change the words. Like, okay, I'm gonna say a pelican, any of 7 to 8 different species, right? You can't do that. That's basically copying. So again, my suggestion, and if you came in late, don't worry about this, I'm recording this. My suggestion for writing these independent work papers, if you're choosing to do papers as opposed to like a 1-point thing, take the information, whatever it is, read the document as many times as you can, memorize what it says, then write it from memory, and then again, compare what you wrote to what's in your source and make sure it matches. Or you could do like I was saying right before you guys came in, which is just take notes, like shorthand notes, and say, like for example, okay, hold on. Let me give you an example here. So, pelicans eat fish while they catch using the extendable hook pouch of the dip net. Okay, so I'll put food, fish, right? And then let's see what else. The pouch is not used to store the fish, which are swallowed immediately. I'm not even going to put that in there. All right. One species, the brown pelican, captures fish by a spectacular plunge from the air. Okay. I can put, again, just shorthand. Brown pelican eats by diving from air. See what I mean? So again, shorthand, and then take those notes to write your paper. But don't do what I just showed you, which was copy and paste it and change some words. And just one last reminder too, from now on, since I'm so busy, because most of you guys waited until the end to do your papers, I don't have time to fool around. So if you mess up, I'm just gonna say that paper's a 0 and move on. So, and one of you messed up, and you know who you are, it's no big deal because it was your first paper, but you see, like I'll say, this wasn't in your source. And this person, since it was their first paper, and because I was caught up with Greg yesterday, I said, hey, I need you to fix this. But in the future, if you have information that's in your paper that's not in your source, I'm just gonna assume that was written by AI, because I'm thinking, oh, where'd you get that information? So make sure, don't use AI, make sure that all the information in your paper is in your source. Make sure you don't copy, make sure you don't reword. What else? And again, to me, the easiest topics you could write about would be anything that I teach you. Again, second guess me. So you said the definition of this is this. According to my source, the definition of this is that. And then just write a little bit, comparing and contrasting. Their definition is different than your definition in this way, but it's the same in that way. Does that make sense? You're just questioning what I'm writing. But anyway, that being said, we're almost out of time. That being said, when it comes time for you to write your paper, even though I keep telling you how to do it, don't feel bad if you need to come to me for help and ask me. Say, meet me online, and we can talk, and I can help you start writing your first paper. We can do it one-on-one. The last thing I want to say to remind you, since we're still recording, in the last few seconds we have left here. Extra credit. Just speaking, meeting me online. If you want to meet me online, we can go over any old assignment. Let me give you feedback for any old assignment. You get a 5% boost to that grade. That's very important for your first 3 exams, because if you can get all the correct answers to the first 3 exams, then you have a great study guide. Because remember, the final exam, 50 questions come directly from the first 3 exams. So half of your exam is based on the questions you already had. So wouldn't it help to know all the correct answers? Not only that, but again, 5% boost to your grade. All right, it's almost 8. I'm gonna go ahead and do this because we have to cover 2 chapters in 2 days. So here we go. Is Aki here? Yep, Aki is here. Extra credit for today since it's already. That'll be at the end. And there's a document out there that I shared with you that'll give you the details about how it's added. But if you want to let me know if you want to know the details, let me know. All right, Bonner is here. Clay is not here. Dawson is here. Yeah, Dawson is here. Ellis is not here. Castro, not here. Green is not here. Harrison is here in WVSU gear. Actually, it doesn't even matter because everybody's getting double the extra credit today for being here. Henson is here. I see James back there. Not yet. Kesterson is not here. King. Yep, King's here. Lewis is here. Linda Q is not here. Morrison is here. Excuse me. Grace is not here. Ward is not here. Wilcox is here. And Wilder is not here. Parks is not here. All right, I'm going to go quickly because, like I said, we've got a lot to cover. So if you have any questions, as I'm going through, usually I stop a lot when I'm doing lectures and I say, hey, do you have any questions about this? Do you have any questions about that? I don't have time this time. So take little notes. If there's anything you need me to explain, take notes, and then we can meet afterwards. And we can talk either during office hours and I can explain the concept that you didn't get. Because like I said, we're in a hurry. So once again, I'll remind you that these PowerPoints are based off of the old textbook, because I like the way they present some of these chapters. For that reason, chapter 20 and 21 are going to be combined into this one PowerPoint. Because in your old textbook, those two chapters were indeed one chapter. So here we go. It's broken down into these 4 parts. Biodiversity, community ecology, which we've sort of talked about a little bit. We talked about population ecology, but not community ecology. Likewise, we're going to take it up another step and talk about ecosystem ecology, which again, it's another step up from community ecology, which is a step up from population ecology. So you've already tested the waters a little bit. And then finally, we'll talk about conservation and restoration biology. So the first word for attendance will be that first word written right there, which is biodiversity. Biodiversity is the first word for attendance. And again, for those of you who are here, obviously you've got your 4 points of extra credit. But if you also send those words in, then you get more than 4 points. Anyway, here we go. Let's talk about the biological diversity, or what it is. You would definitely need to know the definition. I shouldn't say definitely. You're most likely going to need to know the definition of biodiversity. So here it is. It's the variety of living things, basically. First, memorize that, then we'll start talking about some details. But definitely know that biodiversity is the variety of living things. Once you have that memorized, then we can talk about what it includes. It includes genetic diversity, which I'll explain later in the PowerPoint. It explains species diversity, or includes species diversity, which I'll explain later in the PowerPoint. It includes ecosystem diversity, which I'll explain later in this PowerPoint. So yeah, no need to write those down yet. We're going to talk about them separately. I will tell you this, again, for the exam, you probably will need to know the definition of biodiversity. And I can, again, meet you after class if you still need some more clarity on any of this. And of course, for the exam, for these 3 things, you're going to need to know the difference between them. I'm not necessarily going to ask you the definition of any of those things, I don't think. I think instead I'm going to give you an example and say, all right, was that genetic, species, or ecosystem diversity? So here we go. Let's dive into these 3 different types of diversity. All right, first we'll talk about genetic diversity. As you might imagine, if we had time, I would ask you to guess. But let's just jump into it. Genetic diversity in a population is basically the variation of alleles. That's all it is. So think about like the genome or the gene pool, which we've already talked about earlier, if I remember correctly. It's basically the gene pool, right? If you're looking at the genetic diversity of the population, you're looking at the gene pool. You're looking at the variation in alleles, right? So there are a lot of different versions of these different genes this particular population have. Or are all the versions the same, right? Because remember, an allele is a different version of a gene. So genetic diversity in a population, as you already know, and so obviously you should know it for the exam, it is the raw material that makes microevolution and adaptation possible. That's directly from your book. When you think about it, it's really the raw material that makes any evolution possible. Without genetic diversity, there is no evolution. Because this genetic diversity in a population makes some individuals more likely to survive and reproduce than others. And again, that's where evolution comes from. So, let's talk about what would happen if you lost an entire population, which does happen sometimes. Granted, keep in mind, when I say when you lose a population, I mean a population. And to remind you how a population is different than a species. A population, you're talking about one species that it's in a particular area at a particular time, dealing with all the same factors, right? So, for example, the squirrels on WVSU's campus are a different population than the squirrels in my sister's yard in North Georgia, right? Even though they're the same species, they're a different population because they're in different areas. They're dealing with different things, right? So that's what a population is, to remind you. So let's talk about what happens when a population is lost. obviously, the number of individuals in the species is going to decline. That part's a given, right? If you lose an entire population of a particular species, obviously the entire number of that species has gone down. That part's kind of common sense. However, a little bit more important and a little bit less intuitive is this second bullet point. If you lose the population, you also lose genetic resources for that species. And I've used this same example before, where we talk about how, like for humans, right? A lot of people died from COVID, and it wasn't entirely, I'm oversimplifying for this example, but some people were genetically predisposed for it to kill them. Others of us are genetically predisposed to get sick from it, like I do. Some of us are genetically predisposed, I don't know if you want to use predisposed as a word, but genetically immune to it, right? Some people are barely affected. So that's just a great example. You have these genetic resources that protects your population or the entire species. And then finally, again, for those two reasons here, when you lose a population because these two things happen, that leads to this. It threatens the survival of a species. I guess the big takeaway here is obviously the common sense thing is to say when you lose a population, you lose individuals from the entire species. That part's obvious. Obviously, that's a bad thing. But more importantly and less obvious is this third bullet point, right? It's because not only do you lose individuals, but you're losing a depth of your gene pool, so to speak. And when your gene pool is shallow, it's more dangerous. You're more likely to lose an entire species. All right, so for those of you who came in early, I'll go ahead and let you know I'm not stopping and asking for questions because we're in a hurry. So take notes if you have questions, write it down, and then later I'll explain something. So moving past this, let me give you a good example of this. So this is a real thing. I'm not going to ask you about this example, but there's this thing called bioprospecting. So that is when we have people looking for the development of new medicines, industrial chemicals, other products, things like that. So basically, bioprospecting is, I guess the best way to say it is using this genetic diversity to help with things like farming and medicine, stuff like that. So here's a good example of these Cavendish bananas. I'm not going to ask you any of this. It's just an example. But when you go to the grocery store, that's what you're getting, Cavendish bananas, right? It's not like when you go to the grocery store and look at apples. You have all these different types of apples you can buy. Or even oranges, right? They have different varieties of oranges. When you buy bananas, you're getting Cavendish bananas, right? And then not only that, so not only are you looking at the same type of banana, but they're all clones. Like there's no genetic diversity. Whether you get a banana here in West Virginia or you go to Seattle and go to the grocery store there and get a banana, they are clones of each other. So obviously there's zero genetic diversity. Therefore, if there's one pathogen that could wipe out one tree, then it's capable of wiping them all out. Because if one tree is susceptible genetically to that disease, then obviously they all are, because they're all clones of each other. And this isn't just hypothetical. One pathogen has emerged, and that has triggered a search for wild species thought to have no value. I thought I heard something about that on a talk show. I haven't looked it up, but that might be a recent development you could look up for independent work. Look this up, right? So again, Cavendish bananas are threatened, but people are working on trying to save them by looking at these wild varieties of bananas and looking at their genomes to see if they can find some genes that are in the wild bananas that aren't in these cloned bananas. And if so, you crossbreed them or genetically modify them to protect it. So again, you can look that up for independent work if you want. Yeah. So again, normally I would ask if you have any questions, but I'm moving forward. If you have questions, write them down, we'll talk about it. So that's it for genetic diversity. And next we'll talk about species diversity. And again, for the exam, mostly the questions should be regarding these three things: me describing something and then you saying whether or not it's genetic, species, or ecosystem diversity. So we're moving past genetic diversity and talking about species diversity. This is pretty simple. Species diversity is just the number of species on Earth, right? And your book, or at least your old textbook, I don't remember which one, but it mentions that we're pushing species toward extinction at a lot higher rate than we have in a long time, right? So specifically, the present rate of extinction, like losing a species entirely, not just a population, but an entire species, is 100 times higher than any time in the past 100,000 years. And again, independent work idea, not just for this, but for anything. You can just look that up and say, hey, your PowerPoint said this. According to this source, this is the answer. And then again, in your own words, you could write about how it's similar or different. Anyway, at the current rate, over 1/2 of all the plant and animal species may be gone by the end of the century, according to either your textbook or your old textbook. I don't remember which. But I will put a big old X through here indicating I'm not going to ask you any questions about those numbers. Point is, species diversity is an important thing, and it's a very relevant thing because we are losing a lot of species. Here's some examples from your book. Again, I don't remember if it's the old textbook or the new textbook. But Hector's dolphin, this is endangered. No, this is the old textbook. I remember. So as of 2016, I think it was, I don't remember the year for sure that it was published, that was an endangered species. That's one thing you can look up for independent work. Again, is that still endangered? Or maybe is it critically endangered now, which would be worse? Or is it no longer endangered, which would be good? Or is it extinct, which would be a lot worse, right? Check on the status of that, see if that's still the case. Same with this. Back when this book was published, there was a Formosan clouded leopard, and I still haven't changed my PowerPoint because I like this. This is just because it's a good reminder. So yeah, the PowerPoint says it's extinct, but I can tell you now it is no longer extinct. Back when this book was published, they thought they were extinct. They've since been found, which is again a great independent work topic, right? So when exactly, when and how was the Formosan clouded leopard found? Declared not extinct anymore. For that matter, actually I won't get to that yet. Give me a second. Here's some non-book examples. So I just looked these up. And I'm not going to ask you about these. These are all just examples. There'll be no questions about these animals. But West African black rhinoceros, I chose that because back when I started teaching this course, that was like the newest extinction. So that's still relatively new. Passenger pigeon, I chose that because that's from the United States. So they used to be all over the United States, and we killed them off. And then same thing with Carolina parakeet. That's something that used to be in West Virginia, but no longer is. Which reminds me, again, another good independent work topic. When it comes to Carolina parakeets, are they only extinct in West Virginia, or are they completely extinct? Because I really don't remember. So we could look that up. Anyway, again, I'll put a big old X through here because those are just examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions. If you download the PowerPoint, you can see here that any three of these is a link to a little YouTube, so you can watch little short videos that talk a little bit more about this. All right. But yeah, so another good independent work topic. So I just gave you a couple of book examples and then 3 non-book examples of things that have gone extinct. So for independent work, for one point, you could just look up another example and say, hey, I looked it up. According to this source, here's another example of a species that's gone extinct. For one point, right? Just send it in an email. Or you could write a paper about it and just talk about, if you choose one species, like, all right, here's a species that's gone extinct. This is when it went extinct. This is how they think it happened. Just any information you could think to include with that. The next word for attendance, since we're already pointing at it, is Carolina. Carolina is the next word for attendance. Speaking of words of attendance, again, obviously if you're here, you don't need the words, but that'll just get you extra credit. If you came in late, you should send the words because then I know how much extra credit to give you. Otherwise, you get 0 credit. Plus, I need to know you were here. Anyway, here's some more current assessments. And again, I'm going to put an X to this because I don't think I'm going to ask you these specific numbers. And again, I'll remind you, you can look these things up for independent work and say, again, as an example, according to your PowerPoint, about 13% of the 10,004 bird species and about 1/4 of the 5,488 mammal species are now threatened with extinction, right? That's what I'm telling you at the time of publication, that was true. So you can look that up, right? According to you, these are the numbers, and according to this source, these are the numbers, right? Because things change. Speaking of which, over 20% of freshwater fish have become extinct during the human's history, or at least seriously threatened. And about 41% of amphibians are now threatened with extinction. And of the about 20,000 United States, plant species in the United States, 200 of them have become extinct. And over 10,000 plant species worldwide are threatened with extinction. So once again, these are numbers I'm probably not going to ask you about. It's just driving the point home. This is why this is important, right? We're not just, I love to use the term tree huggers. We're not just being tree huggers, like, oh, we need to save the whales, but it's a big problem. We're going to lose species. So why does that even matter, right? So again, unless some people don't care, right? It's like, okay, what's the matter if we lose this species of tree frog or this species of whatever plant, right? So what does it matter to us? And this next bullet point kind of gets us there. We're going to talk about ecosystem diversity. But before we can talk about ecosystem diversity, let's talk about what an ecosystem is. We talked about that last chapter. We're talking about it again. Now we're going to talk about it kind of in a different context. So in this context of these two chapters, an ecosystem includes the organisms and the abiotic factors in a particular area. So really quickly, just to back out again. Let me back up for a second. So mind you, the last chapter we talked about was population ecology, right? So we were really looking at populations. Once again, for the second time today, to remind you what a population is, that is a group of organisms of the same species that are living in the same area at the same time, right? So they're dealing with the same factors, they're competing for the same resources, they're mating with each other, right? That is a population. A step up from a population is a community. So let me back it up. Sorry, one more step. So again, using the same example, you talk about all the gray squirrels on WVSU's campus. That would be a population. A step up from that is something called a community. So that's when you're looking at all the populations in an area. So not just all the squirrels on WVSU's campus, but all the oak trees on WVSU's campus, all the humans on WVSU's campus, right? Every living thing in this area, that would be a community. And then finally, we take it one step higher, and that's where we get to an ecosystem. An ecosystem is still looking at a community, so all the living things and how they're interacting with each other. But now it also takes into account the abiotic factors, right? So not just how the cats, the squirrels on the campus are running from the cats, but also how does the climate around here affect the squirrels? How does the air quality affect the squirrels? Things like that, right? So again, for an ecosystem, we're still looking at communities, all these living things and how they interact with each other. But now we're looking at also how non-living things affect these living things. Anyway, due to interactions among different species, the loss of one species can have a negative effect on an entire ecosystem. So going back to what I was saying back when we were on this slide, I'm like, oh, what's this matter? Who cares if we lose a particular type of frog, right? What's that matter? And the reason is when you lose a species, that harms an ecosystem. And of course, later I'm going to say, what's that matter? What happens if we lose an ecosystem? That'll be important later. But for now, that's the problem, right? If you lose a species in a ecosystem, that's not good because these ecosystems have all these living and non-living things that are interacting with each other, and they've evolved to do so. So if you take a piece out, that's really not good. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's not so good moving forward. Speaking of which, why do ecosystems matter, right? And it's not just a tree-hugging thing where some people will be like, actually, I'll give you a good example. I had to trim my tree in the front yard yesterday, and my daughter didn't know it was happening. When she came home, she actually literally cried a little bit, and that's not funny, but anyway, it was a big tree that had a lot of foliage, and they didn't just trim it. They took down all the foliage. So now we got this big bald tree in the front yard. That hurt her feelings. But anyway, it's not just that. It's not just like, oh, I love trees because I love trees. There's something called ecosystem services, which you do need to know for the exam. These are functions that are performed by an ecosystem that directly or indirectly benefit people, right? So again, this isn't just a tree hugging thing. This is a survival thing. We need ecosystems to live. Among other things, ecosystems provide us fresh air. They provide us water purification. They provide climate regulation. They provide erosion control. There's a lot of things they provide us. That's just some of it. Some examples include how forests can absorb and store carbon, right? So as we burn fossil fuels, we're releasing carbon that hasn't been in the atmosphere for millions of years. So our carbon levels are going up, but forests can take some of that out. That's a benefit for us. Coral reefs, they provide food for the people and the animals that live there. They provide storm protection. I don't know how familiar you guys are with that, but because they make things shallower, that protects from storm surge. Then also recreation, which might seem like nothing, but I'm from South Florida, so is Morrison's from South Florida. So for example, when I lived in the Keys, I won't say the entire, but almost the entire economy is based on tourism, which is based on recreation, right? So everybody gets their jobs down there because people are coming down to see the coral reefs. So once again, this isn't just like a tree hugging thing. It's like, oh, I love coral reefs. This, in this example, for the people of Key Largo, is the same as you guys, how you might feel about coal, right? That's our job. That's what pays our people in the state, right? Same thing there, right? That people come down there to see these things, to go fishing, scuba diving. Anyway, on a related note, the old textbook gives some more specifics about that. I'm not going to ask you about these specifics, but we will say it really quickly. Coral reefs are very rich in species diversity, yet about 20% of them have been destroyed by humans. And that number is probably different by now. It's probably worse. You can look that up for the bit of work if you want. 75% of coral reefs are threatened, and that number is expected to top 90% by 2030 if current abuses continue. Then again, I'm glad your textbook uses that example because I'm familiar with that example. My uncle used to run dive boats in the Florida Keys, and he tells me, like he knows, he's seen it firsthand, like the coral reefs are nothing like they used to be because they're all dying off. And again, you guys might not care because you're like, oh, whatever, it's coral reefs. But for them, that's their economy. Anyway, so that's it for the 3 different types of biodiversity: genetic diversity, species diversity, ecosystem diversity. So really quickly as another overview, we get really specific here for the genetic diversity, then we get broader on that. Long story short is we need biodiversity. We need all this variety of life just for life to continue. Right? So all these individual species, sure, they might have some value just because they exist. But if you don't believe that, they have value because they help us exist, right? We need them just to live. So let's talk about the causes of declining biodiversity. There are 4 main factors. There's no need to write these down yet if you're a note taker, because we're going to talk all about each one of them individually. But the first one is habitat destruction or fragmentation. The other one is invasive species, which we've already talked about. So when we go through this, I'm going to go through it very quickly, quicker than I already am. Then there's overexploitation, and then finally there's pollution, right? And all of these things are exacerbated by the fact that the human population is expanding, right? So not only are we expanding, but a lot of us are becoming more affluent. So we're just using more resources. And as we lose more resources, we're making these 4 things worse. So we're about to discuss all 4 separately. And again, I know I sound like a broken record here, but this isn't all about tree hugging stuff. This isn't all about save the whales and all that. This is important for our survival. So here we go. Let's talk about the first one, habitat destruction. One thing you definitely need to know about this for the exam is this bullet point here. That is definitely a test question. Of the 4 types, or 4 reasons for biodiversity decline, this one, habitat destruction, is the greatest threat to biodiversity. So you definitely need to know that. Habitat destruction, the greatest threat. And here's the way you can remember that. And I'll come back to this slide in a second, but let me back up to the one we were at previously. Think about this. When you have an invasive species come in, what's it do? It destroys the habitat, amongst other things. When you have overexploitation, what's it do? It destroys the habitat. When you have pollution, what does it do? It destroys the habitat. So if you can just remember that all the other 3 things also destroy habitat, hopefully that'll help you remember that habitat destruction is the number 1 reason. I'm probably not going to ask you examples, but yes, habitat destruction comes from many different industries: agriculture, urban development, forestry, mining. That's really big for us. There's a picture of a mountaintop removal here in West Virginia, right? So that's a great example of habitat destruction. Another thing I'm not going to ask you about is this particular number here, but just so you know, back when this was published, habitat destruction affects over 85% of birds, mammals, and amphibians that have been threatened with extinction. So again, long story short, it's a big deal. And again, for the exam, as far as the exam is concerned, that bullet point right there is the most important. And it's pretty simple, right? Habitat destruction, destroying the habitat, destroying where things live. It's pretty simple. The next one, like I said, we're going to go through it very quickly because we already talked about it in the last chapter. So we're just looking at it from a different perspective. For the exam, this is probably the most important bullet point right here. Invasive species are the 2nd greatest threat to biodiversity. Why? As you already know from the last chapter, invasive species compete with native species, or they prey on native species, or sometimes they parasitize native species, right? So long story short, invasive species are bad for native species, right? So one way or the other, they're either killing them or outliving them, right? Finally, the other one, this one's also very simple, over-exploitation. This can be from harvesting at rates that exceed the ability of populations to rebound. So this we've already talked about too. When we talked about the North Atlantic cod industry in the last chapter about how they messed up their numbers, and because of that, they overexploited, right? They caught too many fish, and then they couldn't rebound because of it, so the whole population crashed. That's what overexploitation is. It comes from excessive commercial harvesting, poaching, sport hunting, things like that. Your book gave some examples of tigers, American bison, and Galapagos tortoises. I'm not going to ask you about those examples. This is another great independent work topic. Give me some other examples of species that have been harmed due to overexploitation. Whether they're currently being harmed, or maybe they used to be harmed and then we fixed it and now they're rebounding, or unfortunately, what if maybe they've been overexploited and now they're extinct? So you can look that up for examples of independent work. And then, of course, I'm not going to ask you this. This is another example. So it's not just animals like you see right here with these three. You also have plants, right? Like rare trees like mahogany and rosewood. But once again, I'm not going to ask you about those examples. So that's it for overexploitation. Very simple, right? Just overexploiting something, like harvesting it too much. And then finally, the last cause of declining biodiversity is pollution. And this is very simple, right? I mean, pollution kills things. That's basically it. Air and water pollution are a contributing factor in declining populations of many species. So here you have a picture of this pelican that's covered in oil. That's very obvious pollution, right? But it's not always that obvious, as you know, because you've done that voice and water video. If you haven't, probably should. But anyway, so as you know, like for example, remember they were talking about those frogs, maybe they're fish. The fish in the Potomac River that had intersex, basically they're like two different sexes. That's because of all the endocrine disruptors in the water. And when you look at water that has endocrine disruptors in it, it looks fine. It can look nice and clear and beautiful. So it's not always something obvious like an oil spill, right? So water pollution comes in many different forms. Same with air pollution. Ozone, for example, it's great when it's up in the atmosphere where we need it. It's bad when it's on the ground level. But either way, it's clear, so you can't see it. Anyway, so this is important because the global water cycle transports pollutants from the terrestrial to aquatic ecosystems that are 100 miles away. I'm not going to ask you about that bullet point, but it is a great thing to consider. Like when you think about here in West Virginia, right? You might be driving down the road in Scott Depot and throw some wrapper out of your window, and then it blows down the road into a creek, and the next time it rains, that creek takes it to the Kanawha River, and then it goes from the Kanawha River to the Ohio River, and then from the Ohio River to the Mississippi River, and then finally makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic, right? So even things you do here can affect the world, right? And that's just the water cycle. Then, of course, you have pollutants in the atmosphere that can be carried for thousands of miles that fall as acid precipitation, amongst other things. Another good example of that, bringing together where we are now and where I'm from, there's a lot of mercury that ends up in the Florida Everglades, and that mercury comes from the burning of coal. So here we are burning coal at John Amos, and that's just carried thousands of miles away, and we're okay. We're not getting affected by that mercury, but it's landing in the Everglades and it's killing things. And again, moving past the tree-hugging nature of saying, oh my goodness, that's not good for the animals. It's also not good for the economy, because when things die and people go to the Everglades to see nature, if nature is dying off, then that's going to affect your tourism dollars. Anyway, so that's it for the causes of declining biodiversity. If you have questions, write them down, ask me later. Let's move into community ecology. If we can finish this, we'll be halfway through, which would be perfect, because we only have one more day to finish this. So community ecology. I already told you what a community is. I backed up. Remember we talked about population, and then a step up from a population is a community. Really quickly, here it is again, because you need to know it for the exam. It is the assemblage of species living close enough together for potential interaction. And again, as usual, when I'm telling you you need to know a definition, you don't necessarily need to know it verbatim. Just know what the words mean. So again, a population is just like one species, organisms of the same species that are living together and interacting together. The community is a step up from that. It's not just one species and how they interact with each other.
It's all the species in an area interacting with each other. This picture is a great example. It's from the old textbook, right? So here you have, a lion that is killed and is going to eat that zebra. And it's competing against these scavengers, this hyena and these vultures, right? So there's some competition going there. This thing is going to die, once it's whatever's left of it's going to rot, and its nutrients are going to go back into the soil, and then the plants are going to use it, and the plants are going to grow. And then another zebra is going to eat those plants, and then it's going to poop, and then that's going to fertilize the grass, right? So these are all these things interacting. That's what a community is. So let's talk about some of these interactions. We're going to talk about some interspecific interactions. Last chapter, we talked about intraspecific interactions, which is when you have two members of the same species interacting with each other. Here, we're talking about different species interacting with each other, and you're going to need to know the difference between these. Most likely on the exam, I'm going to give you an example and say, is that an example of interspecific competition, mutualism, predation, herbivory, parasites and pathogens, or commensalism? So that's how it's going to go. So I'm probably not going to ask you the definition of any of these things. I'm probably going to give you an example, and you have to determine which is which. But nonetheless, here's the definition of interspecific interactions. It's interactions between species, right? So interactions between different species. The way you can remember that, I don't know if you can see what that is. That's a picture of I-64. That's an interstate. The reason it's called an interstate is because it goes between different states. So if you can remember that an interstate takes you between different states, then hopefully you can remember that interspecific interactions are interactions between different species. Again, as opposed to intraspecific interactions, which is when the same species are interacting together. The next word for attendance is what you see on the slide right there. It's a map. Of course, it's kind of hard to see, but yeah, that is the map. So before we get into herbivory, predation, pathogens, and all that, there's an even more broad way to describe these interactions, right? They can be negative, which is when it's bad for both of the species. And I'll give you some examples of those, right? So when species are competing for the same resources, that would be bad for both of them, right? Because they're competing. Then you have a positive, which is when whatever their interaction is between those different species, they both benefit from it. And I'll give you some examples of those when the time comes. And then you have positive. That's when one species benefits from their interaction and one is hurt, right? So like, for example, that picture we saw earlier, the lion eating the zebra, right? That was a positive for the lion. It was a negative for the zebra. All right, so let's talk about interspecific competition in a little bit more detail. Again, this is a competition between species. Now, when this happens, the population growth of these two species are limited by the population densities of the competing species and the density of their own population. So again, basically that's saying we have two different species that are competing against each other. Obviously, the one that has a higher density, the one with higher numbers, usually going to do better. Is basically what that's saying. So, what determines if populations will compete or not? Right? Just because they're in the same area doesn't mean they're competing. So let's talk about this. To understand that, you need to understand this term: ecological niche or niche, however you want to pronounce it. Either way. This is an organism's total use of biotic and abiotic resources. I don't remember if I'm going to ask you that definition, but I think at the very least I'm going to use that word in a question, so you need to know what it means, right? It's an organism's total use of the biotic and abiotic resources. It's almost like, what does an organism do for that area, right? Like if I were talking about a particular tree, it's like, all right, well, it needs this much water and this type of soil, and it lives from this temperature range to this temperature range, and the soil needs to be this particular pH, right? That's its niche. But here's some examples from, I think, the old textbook, maybe the new one too. But these barnacles are a great example. So there's this particular genus of these barnacles, and your book gets specific and gives you a name, but I don't care. As a matter of fact, because this is an example, I'm not going to ask you about it or ask you to memorize any of this. But anyway, we have this one genus, but it includes two different species, right? But this genus, when we're talking about the ecological niche of this genus, it includes the space on the rocks where it lives, right? So they can't just live anywhere. They're very specific to where they have to live. So that's a part of their ecological niche. The food that it filters from the water, right? It eats particular things. It eats this, not that, right? That's its ecological niche. And finally, climatic conditions. Like what is the water temperature, the air temperature, the humidity of the air, the cleanliness of the water, all these things, right? That's the ecological niche of this genus of barnacles. And if you don't know what barnacles are, that's okay. On the next slide, I'll show you a picture. Hopefully that'll help you understand. So, excuse me, I said that wrong. We're not looking at one genus. We're looking at two different genuses, right? So we've got one genus that needs all these things. Then we have this other genus that lives in the same area, and it has a very similar ecological niche. And because of that, they're competing. They're in competition. And again, this will make more sense on the next slide. I'm going to show you a visualization of this. So when these two genuses of barnacles in the same area, they are then going through interspecific competition. The reason they are is because, again, their niches are very similar. They have an overlapping niche, meaning they need some of the same stuff. They need the same place to live. They need the same food, right? So when they're together, again, you can see here they're competing. And you can tell by looking that these, the darker, browner ones, whatever, those things obviously have a higher tolerance of being out of the water, right? Because they're found way up here. These in the blue, they obviously do better when there's water. So when they're together, they're competing with each other. And the thing that keeps them separate, and that, again, this is just an example, you don't need to know this. These things just do better being out of the water, and these things do very well when they're in the water. So when they're together, they kind of separate from each other because they're in competition. But somebody did a study, and they removed this genus of these blue ones, and they found out that these other ones, they took over the whole area. So it isn't that these don't like the water, right? It's just that these do better out of the water, and once these other ones are gone, then they take over that niche. Hope that makes sense, right? So when these could take over the whole thing, but they don't when they're in competition. All right, we're going to be done in 2 minutes, which brings us to this. Let's talk about this, and then we'll be done. The competitive exclusion principle. You need to know about this for the exam. If two species have an ecological niche that's too similar, like the one we just saw, they cannot coexist in the same place. So again, they didn't, right? They separated themselves because they compete. So that's what happens. I'm going to give you this example of these two different species of paramecium. Basically, when they grew them in like little petri dishes and they grew them separately and tracked their population, you can see they had similar population growths, right? But when they grew together, what happened is one outcompeted the other. So this one survived, that one crashed, right? Because they're competing for each other. They cannot coexist in the same place. This is a great thing about biodiversity. In nature, when this happens, let's say this is anything else, it doesn't have to be paramecium. If there's something out there that's a predator that's eating these things, once this species outcompeted this species, then it's going to be eaten more, right? And this species is going to go down while this one goes up. So that's the great thing about biodiversity. And again, in that one example, the predator would keep this from happening. It would keep that what's the word I'm looking for? Very successful species from getting too successful, right? If you get too successful, you start getting eaten more, and then the other species has a chance to catch up. The last word for attendance will be cultures. So now what you're going to do is Doug is going to come in and he's going to explain how to do the student evaluations. I will be online. Please let me help you. Some of you really have a lot of catching up to do. I'm here to help you do that. Doug, you can come in.